Looking for some adrenaline-fueled excitement? The motorbike's just not cutting it for you? Well, Agenda might be just what you're looking for as we consider two bills which are currently making their way through Keys and LegCo. The Sanctions Bill aims to provide a modern and flexible framework to allow Manx authorities to implement UK sanctions, and the Income Tax Bill clarifies a possible technical flaw in Manx tax law. Yes, two fascinating bills on this week's show. Three, if you include Bill Henderson. The Treasury Minister, Alex Allinson, steered the Sanctions Bill through a largely silent House of Keys this week. The bill aims to provide a modern and flexible legislative framework to allow the Manx authorities to implement UK sanctions in a timely manner, allowing us to meet international obligations in relation to preventing money laundering, terrorist financing and nuclear proliferation. The Minister explains why the bill has been introduced.
What we're doing at the moment is looking, in a world post-Brexit, as the UK change all their regulations and legislation to be far more autonomous, how we can align with them in terms of sanctions, often which are brought in internationally through either the EU or normally from the United Nations, and how we can do that in a more efficient way, because at the moment the situation is a bit clunky with the legislation coming through. We're living in a very rapidly evolving world where sanctions have been needed to be brought in quite quickly, and we've seen that particularly with Russia and Belarus. And so this will hopefully streamline that process while still retaining parliamentary scrutiny and allow officers working in the Treasury to concentrate more on the enforcement of sanctions rather than running around trying to get the regulations up to date.
And in essence, as you say, you're taking what is a system which imposes sanctions and various other measures via various means. There's the Terrorism Act, there's UK legislation, there's various other things. So this actually simplifies the process, would you say?
That's the plan. It makes all the regulations and legislation be in one place so that people who it might affect on our island are aware of it and can get ready access to this, and makes it very apparent to people what our international obligations are. However, there are parts of the bill which may have come to us as a bit of a shock to certain members in terms of the rights of, for instance, the British Navy to come into our territorial waters and their powers there. Now, those powers do exist for the United Kingdom, but would be illegal. And so what we're looking at is working quite closely with the UK to retain our territorial independence, but also make sure that where we need to cooperate with them against things like terrorist financing, against sanctions busting, that we can do that in the right way. I think it's very important for the island. We heard earlier on in the questions that we've removed registration from 22 aircraft and 49 yachts over the last year in terms of our international obligations for sanctions, to dealing really with the war in the Ukraine. And so the Sanctions Bill are an extension of that to show that we're very committed to our international obligations, but try to retain that autonomy as well, that Tynwald and everyone on our island is aware of what we're doing.
You can imagine a situation where a drug smuggler or a international terrorist or whatever is on a yacht and heading out of North Wales perhaps, and let's head over to the Isle of Man because we know that the Navy can't follow us there. But this legislation obviously deals with that. However, if they were coming from, Dunleary or Dublin somewhere, and bearing in mind, a lot of our territorial sea abuts Irish territorial sea, the same provision wouldn't apply. So what consideration was given to that?
Well, at the moment we have cooperation in terms of customs and excise. So you mentioned drug smuggling. We have agreements with the UK Navy to deal with that in cooperation. They would inform us of their actions, but we actually allow them to operate in our territorial waters for things like drug smuggling, for other aspects that are covered by that. This bill is related to sanctions and sanction busting, and so in terms of the the UK Navy, as I spelt out when we reached that clause, they have the right under UK law to go where they need to go, really, to fulfil their international obligations, whether that would be coming from Ireland, whether it be coming from Scotland, Wales, wherever. They could intercept those vessels, and we've seen that happening in the past in terms of the Gulf and causing some major disagreements between different states. What this legislation does is mean that we can extend that ability for them to work in Manx waters with our consent, and we'll be aware of that, and we're drawing up a various memorandum of understanding with the UK government to allow for that seamless enforcement. We have the barrel, but that's mainly to do with fisheries rather than going after some of these more complicated cases which may require use of force. And so I think it's absolutely imperative that we work quite closely with the UK government in terms of ensuring that sanctions as well as drug smuggling are actually dealt with for the benefit of our island community, but also the international community.
And I suppose that maybe I didn't ask the question as clearly as I should have. Irish authorities chasing a sanctions buster couldn't come into our territorial sea, and yet a lot of our territorial sea abuts Irish territorial sea. Was there any consideration given to similar arrangements with the Irish authorities?
I mean, in terms of this bill, it's really extending UK legislation to us rather than extending any Southern Ireland legislation to us. But we do have really quite close connections with all the members of the Common Travel Area in terms of how we deal with sanctions, with the movement of people and the movement of goods. And so should the situation arise whereby the Irish Navy, for instance, would want to work with our authorities, I'm sure we could accommodate that.
In terms then of the sanctions, I mean, this is primarily about international sanctions, but also UK sanctions. Now, the United Kingdom government, it is fair to say, is perhaps becoming more extreme in the way that it goes about its affairs. Certainly, it's a polarising government. It's pretty clear that the UK government is keen to appeal to its voters as opposed to a kind of a national unity approach. We've seen protesters effectively being arrested for what used to be legal protest. Are you concerned that by effectively having a policy which adopts UK sanctions, we could end up following the UK along a fairly dangerous and polarising political route?
Well, I've always keen not to comment on the UK political scene at the moment or criticise the UK government because they make democratic decisions that have to go through Parliament. I think you're absolutely right that what this bill does is rather than give a rubber stamp to sanctions coming into to the Isle of Man, gives that ability, but it has to be then voted on by Tynwald. There is that affirmative action as part of the bill. So sometimes people switch off a little bit when I stand up and read out a whole load of sanctions, and recently we've had those about Sudan, we've had those about Russia and Belarus, but they're still voted on by our Parliament. They're still approved, and I think that stopgap, that ability to question, is absolutely imperative for our Parliament. There may be times where we don't necessarily agree with sanctions being imposed by other jurisdictions, and the UK blocking provisions that we're adopting as well necessarily block some of the sanctions that were brought in by the United States government against Cuba and Iran, which certainly the UK government and the EU and many people felt were politically motivated rather than anything else. So I think that scrutiny of our Parliament to question some of these sanctions coming in and ask why is absolutely important, and according to the passage of this bill, that will be preserved.
And of course, there is a power within the bill that effectively enables Treasury to impose financial penalties on individuals and companies. But there is also an appeals process associated with that, isn't there?
There is. At the moment, we have the ability to take people to court for breaching sanctions. And what this bill does is, in terms of financial sanctions, allow that leeway to bring in a financial penalty rather than take somebody to criminal court. I think that's important as sanctions become more and more complicated. It also gives the leeway in terms of disapplying civil penalties as well. So if people make an honest mistake, they won't necessarily be taken to court over it. And I think that's one of the main things about consolidating everything under one act, that hopefully we can make sure that people working on the island in the international sphere are more aware of those sanctions that are there, and more aware of their obligations to abide by them.
Were you surprised at the lack of comment on this bill going through the House of Keys?
I mean, before we went through the clauses stage, I did circulate to members quite a detailed description of the bill, why it was being brought in. We had a public consultation about this and put that out to industry and to members of the general public. There were some very interesting comments made there, and we did adjust the bill according to that. I think a lot of people accept the need for sanctions, accept the need for them to be brought in really quite quickly, and appreciate that by simplifying the process under this bill, we can achieve that. But certainly from a Treasury perspective, we're more than happy to take submissions from industry, from members of the public, as we develop this process further, as we bring through the regulations and secondary legislation to make sure we get it right for our island.
It does, though, give Tynwald, House of Keys members obviously are members of Tynwald, and indeed Treasury, quite significant power to impose sanctions upon people. Well, certainly I was quite surprised that there was so little comment. Do you think members of the House of Keys are, I'm trying to think of the best way of putting this, are too eager to sort of go along with the government line, the line of the movers of bills, or perhaps they've had their private conversations and aren't willing to record their views?
No, I don't. I mean, sometimes democracy can be slightly quiet, but we saw in this month's Tynwald some quite heated debates about various bits of legislation that didn't get through and are now going to come through on a combined vote for the next Tynwald. So I think people will pick their battles, what's important for them and their constituents and the Manx people, and act on that accordingly. This bill, as I said, was in some ways quite technical, but very important in terms of its implications. And when you say about Tynwald bringing in sanctions, I think it would be very, very rare for us to unilaterally impose sanctions on anyone. A lot of this bill is about us actually adopting sanctions that have been agreed by the United Nations or by the European Union, and therefore being brought in by the United Kingdom, which still has a very close constitutional relationship with our people.
So basically then, in terms of this piece of legislation, it simplifies procedures for the Isle of Man government to retain its sort of international standing by following particularly international sanctions.
It consolidates all of our sanction legislation in one place, makes it easier for people who that might apply for to understand that. But also, I think, it sends out our commitment to being part of an international community, which is very important when we look at proceeds of crime, the financing of terrorism, because we know that we've got another assessment by Moneyval coming up in the next couple of years. So this is one part of showing not only our commitment to that international the international regulations and standards, but also the moves that we're actively making to ensure that.
That was Treasury Minister and mover of the Sanctions Bill, Alex Allinson. Legislative Council sat on a Monday a few weeks back. I spoke to Bill Henderson MLC shortly after the sitting. Talking to Bill Henderson about the Income Tax Bill 2023. But before we move on to that, Legislative Council was held, almost 24 hours, 23 hours early this week.
Yep, that's correct, Phil. That was at my behest because we normally sit on Tuesdays, and this particular Tuesday, unfortunately for myself, I had a personal commitment I had to absolutely attend, but I wanted to keep the income tax bill going forward through its legislative transit. It's very important, and I wanted to make sure that it's on its way for royal assent sooner rather than later. So that meant canvassing the opinion of the presiding officer, our clerk and Legislative Council members to see if it was possible to hold LegCo at a different time and date. Unfortunately, and luckily for myself and Treasury, the institution was able to accommodate my request, so I expressed my gratitude at the meeting with regards to that, and pleased that we're able to progress this bill.
And of course, the bill itself is really important. It's a technical thing, isn't it? And it comes about as a result of a technicality, in as much as COVID kind of interrupted with legislative timetables, and as a result, a piece of legislation that was required to allow for a temporary tax order to continue. The actual the act missed out by 4 days in terms of getting royal assent, and therefore the order, there was a bit of uncertainty as to whether the order was correct.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Phil. When a temporary taxation order is put to Tynwald, it becomes a piece of primary legislation at that moment, but there's safeguards put in place so that it must receive at least its second reading in a confirmation bill in the House of Keys within 12 months of that Tynwald approval. And secondly, the second safeguard is that it must have the royal assent within 24 months of the day at which it was approved by Tynwald. Two safeguards. Unfortunately, due to the COVID situation over the last couple of years, it has interrupted the smooth flow of gaining royal assent for our acts, and specifically this one, or a potentiality to impact on this one. And just to be sure, and with an abundance of caution, it was deemed that really we should reenact or reconfirm what we already put through to ensure the applicability of this bill, and more importantly the retrospectivity of this bill over the time period in question, so everything runs smoothly and that there's no potential hiccups in the background as we go down where a loophole's discovered or some such problem. So we wanted to ensure that that was properly negated.
And in terms of temporary tax orders, for anyone who's not aware, what's the reason for introducing this? I mean, effectively, it's creating primary legislation, but by using a secondary legislative route, isn't it?
Yeah, basically, yeah, that's correct. These are very, very handy instruments certainly for the likes of Treasury to use, say from a budget point of view in February every year, where we've got various changes made to the income tax regulations and so on because of the budget. Then you need to act fairly swiftly to bring those changes in. So this is one legislative route that actually achieves the quickness or fleetness of foot, if you like, to get your legislative steps in place. And certainly from an international perspective, international standards, and particularly financial standards, can change rapidly. And it's especially useful in those circumstances where the Isle of Man has been and is under the microscope from organisations such as the OECD and the EU Code of Conduct Group and Moneyval, so that if there's recommendations made or we wish to make changes or raise our standards to meet new approved regimes, then we can do it fairly rapidly and within the time scales that those international organisations, which are made up of the major economic players around the globe, would expect from us.
So briefly, again, if you could explain for those who aren't aware, what are the sort of timetable, the likes of the times involved anyway in terms of getting an order through or getting a full bill through?
Well, for a temporary taxation order, the minute the minister announces it in Tynwald and it gains Tynwald approval, from that vote, it's in force. But, as I say, there's two safety guards riding behind that have to be met, otherwise it will fall ultimately. And that being that a bill has to go, a confirmation bill has to go before the House of Keys and the Legislative Council within 12 months, and certainly has to meet the second reading. And then there's the royal assent has to be met within 24 months of the day on which the TTO came in Tynwald. So it can be introduced rapidly, and then there's a process behind it. Normal legislation, however, can take some considerable time, especially through the consultative stages and so on, because it's got various stages. A draft bill has to run through in the House of Keys, first reading, second reading, clauses, final third stage reading, and then it has to go to the Legislative Council for a revision, a safety check, and there again it goes through three principal stages as well. So for a law to become law, if I can put it like that, it can take quite a long time. You're looking at several months to progress through the Keys and then progress through Legislative Council. Then it's got to go for royal assent, and then it's got to be read off Tynwald Hill at and the promulgation of Acts service on Tynwald Day as well, ultimately.
So the complicated procedure is avoided, and relatively urgent things can effectively then be announced. I mean, it'll take as long as it takes to draft the order and then get that onto Tynwald Business, and literally a 5-minute debate if it's a non-contentious piece of legislation and the order's passed.
Yeah, brief overview. Yeah, that's about it, Phil. Although if something urgent is required, the Attorney General's chambers will oblige with their drafting services, and they can then put all their resources to something that is very urgent, for instance, and then obviously it goes through the temporary taxation order process. This is addressing international obligations which we have to meet in order to tick box Moneyval's assessment for the Isle of Man and future requirements. Moneyval are due back here to reassess our work that we've been doing as a consequence of their initial assessment a couple of years or so ago, and they'll come back and reevaluate it and see where we've got up to and have we reached the standards that are required. And that, of course, is an impact on the island's reputation as a excellent offshore financial jurisdiction that operates to the highest standards, which we've also committed to in the Isle of Man Chief Minister's Isle of Man plan. So it's quite important that we get this right.
That was mover of the income tax bill, Bill Henderson MLC. Legislation is often overlooked when we consider Tynwald members' political performance, but it is one of the most important functions they carry out. While Keys members appeared largely focused on managing their emails, the Sanctions Bill, which provides government and Tynwald very significant power to limit prescribed persons and companies' access to property and freedom, sailed through Keys without debate. There are just 21 sittings for each branch each year at which legislation is considered, so is it unreasonable to expect members to take more interest in making the primary laws of our island? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gaughan at manxradio.com, and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now though, I'm Phil Gaughan. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.